Welcome to the Federal Railroad Administration's Corridor ID webinar and policy updates. Hello, everyone. My name is Wynn Davis, and I am the Deputy Director for the Office of Regional Outreach and Project Delivery at FRA. I am joined today by my three colleagues who I will ask to introduce themselves now.
Good morning. This is Lyle Lytell. I'm the Division Chief for Project Planning in FRA's Office of Planning and Engineering.
Hi, everyone. Barbara Moreno, Corridor ID Program Manager.
Morning, David Singer. I'm the planner in the Office of Planning and Engineering.
Over the past several months, we have worked very closely with the new administration to educate them on the CID program, inform them on selections made into the program, and the status of those corridor proposals advancing through the program. We have worked closely with the new administration to ensure our approach to CID reflects their priorities, and we have made some significant changes to the program that reflect the new administration's direction for the program. These new policies are intended to focus the appropriate level of resources on corridors relative to where they are in the planning cycle, on the one hand, and to advance projects that are ready to move into final design and construction on the other. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide you an overview of those key policy updates. The first part of our agenda, we will provide a very high-level overview of the CID program. If this is your first CID webinar, please refer to our webpage for links to previous webinars, as the information presented here builds on the last 2+ years worth of material developed in support of this now not so new, but still very important and exciting program. We strongly encourage you to watch our other two webinars in the order in which they were released for a more comprehensive understanding of the program. Much of the webinar will then focus on two key policy updates. The first update is the core service development plan, and the second is the near-term service development plan. We do have some updates at the end of the webinar on the status of rolling out these new policies and updates to our next steps in the program. Okay, now let's spend a few minutes reminding everyone what is so special about the CID program. What is the Corridor ID or CID program? It's the first of its kind intercity rail planning and development program. It's a national program to advance the planning and development of intercity passenger rail and will ultimately result in a pipeline of projects ready for the implementation phases of FRA's funding programs. And why are we so excited about this program? For the first time, we have the opportunity to partner with corridor sponsors early in the planning process to develop a service development plan, which is viewed collectively as the corridor strategic plan. This early partnership includes stakeholder engagement, so that discussions with potential such as discussions with potential host railroads and other key partners, and is a planning process that is intended to bring all parties along as the planning advances, building support and consensus around what we are trying to do, what we are trying to achieve along the way. The CID program provides sustained support for those planning efforts. What we mean by sustained support is that once selected into the programs, corridors do not need to recompete for funding as a corridor advances through the CID steps, assuming certain readiness criteria are met. The goal of CID is to graduate projects that are ready for the implementation phases of FRA's funding programs. Projects that graduate from the program will be placed on the CID project pipeline and will receive priority funding under the National Railroad Partnership Program. And finally, the CID pipeline of projects will show how continued investment in passenger rail has the support of key stakeholders and will result in tangible benefits nationwide.
In fiscal year 2022, FRA released the first Corridor ID Notice of Funding Opportunity, NOFO, and selected 69 corridors across 44 states to participate in the Corridor ID program. Those 69 corridors can be divided among these 4 categories that you see here on the screen. The first category is new high-speed rail, that is the red dashed line across the screen. The next category is new conventional rail, which is the largest subcategory of Corridor ID selections with 34 corridors. Those corridors are represented by the blue dashed line that you see on the screen. Relatedly, we also selected into the program 13 corridors looking to do extensions to their existing service. These corridors are also reflected by the blue dashed line. And last but not least, we selected 15 corridors to improve their existing service, which would include reducing trip times or increasing frequencies. These are represented by the solid blue line. Now I will go over the structure of the Corridor ID program. So the 69 corridors that were selected and showcased on the previous slide are currently undergoing this process as we speak. The first step of the Corridor ID program is to develop a scope, schedule, and budget for how you're going to either update or develop a new service development plan. The scope, schedule, and budget that is developed in step 1 is then carried over into step 2, where it's actually implemented and executed and sponsors develop their service development plan. Majority of the corridors in the Corridor ID program are currently in this step. About 90% of the corridors are in step 1 of the process. In step 2, about 10% of the corridors are currently in that part of the process of the Corridor ID program. And then in step 3, that is where projects undergo project level NEPA or preliminary engineering, so generally project development. Once corridors have completed all 3 steps, that is when they would go on to the project pipeline that Wynn was referencing earlier in her slides. An important thing to note is that each of these steps requires their own separate grant agreement. And if you would like to learn more about these steps and go into more detail as to why they're separate, we highly recommend checking out the other webinars on our website.
Okay, now on to the substance of our webinar. From the beginning of the program, we have made a commitment to corridor sponsors that we will meet you where you are in the planning cycle. Of the more than 65 corridors currently in the program, there are a range of types of corridors with various levels of effort associated with their service development plans. And many corridors are further along in the planning cycle than others. As we continue to establish the guiding policies of the program, we continue to refine our approach to better support the range of corridors in the program. So first, what are the various types of corridors selected? We have entirely new service, extensions to existing service, and improvements to existing service, such as increased frequencies, significant trip time reduction, or combination of both, or a combination of these and extensions, and maybe just modest improvements to existing service. Of these types of corridors, there is a corresponding level of effort associated with the planning required. For new services, we see a very high level of overall effort for improvements to existing service. For improvements to existing service, we see a more moderate level depending on the proposal. These can still be very complex planning efforts, but much of the heavy lift required to get a service up and running is already complete. And then we can have a very low level of effort for a service development plan for an existing service that may just be addressing state of good repair and or station issues. This chart shows FRA's project lifecycle stages. Corridor ID occurs in the development stages. Steps 1 and 2 are the planning stage. Step 3 is the project development or PE NEPA stage. And projects that ultimately graduate from CID will move on to the CID pipeline and be positioned for priority funding under the NRP, as we've now mentioned a few times. So here we show a combination of the previous 2 slides where the level of effort is on the left and the progression through the life cycle is on the bottom of the slide. When we initially developed our SDP framework, we had in mind a corridor like Corridor B. Corridor B has completed enough planning work to have moved beyond the feasibility stage. It has a market analysis and has completed enough planning work to have developed initial timetables. Corridors like Corridor B will continue through the program and are not really the focus of this webinar. What we are focusing on today there are over 20 corridors that have little to no work completed to date, represented here by Corridor A. For these corridors, we've concluded that it makes more sense to undertake an initial planning effort, a planning effort that focuses on a corridor's feasibility before committing resources to a more comprehensive, resource-intensive, and expensive planning effort. At the direction of the new administration, and in order to ensure the CID program is aligned with their priorities to apply the appropriate level of resources to the appropriate phase of the project development lifecycle, we are working with the over 20 corridor sponsors to complete what we are calling a core SDP. Barbara, Lyle, and David will spend the next part of this webinar explaining the core SDP framework. The spectrum of meeting you where you are, this part of the webinar will focus on existing corridors to the bottom and right side of this chart. Corridors that have advanced capital projects through efforts prior to and outside the CID program. We will provide more direction on the near-term SDP concept that we rolled out last year. In keeping with our commitment to meet corridors and sponsors where they are in the project development lifecycle, and in support of FRA's goal for the CID project pipeline to accurately reflect all passenger rail projects that are ready for implementation, the near-term SDP approach allows corridor sponsors to submit FRA capital projects that have completed the requisite planning activities associated with Step 2 to satisfy the statutory requirement of an SDP and are ready to advance into subsequent stages of the project lifecycle prior to completion of an SDP for the full corridor. So that's a lot of words, but you can think of projects that result from this effort as having completed the requisite planning to, quote, graduate from the CID program, had the CID program been in existence for the last decade or so.
Hi, I am Terry Brown. I'm editor of the Borealis newsletter, and joining me is Ian Weiser, the Vice President for WisARP for Internet Communications. He is the main guru for WisARP and the Corridor ID program. So, Ian, in a short period of time here, let's get going. Let's start with the Hiawatha Corridor and WisDOT's attempt to get up to 10 trains a day.
Thanks, Terry. That's actually a pretty big question. WisDOT has two projects, both of which together are trying to raise the number of Hiawatha trains from 7 to 10 every day. One of the projects predates the Corridor ID program. One of them is the later Corridor ID program. The earlier program is probably going to achieve its goal sometime in 2026 or 2027 of getting one additional Hiawatha trip. The Corridor ID program is about to begin planning for the remaining trips to get up to 10.
Okay, so just so everybody knows, the first one that you spoke of, that could happen when the Milwaukee Airport Station is completed.
There are three things that need to happen. The Milwaukee Airport Station is one of them. The others kind of depend on federal funding and when grants become available. But it's looking right now as though they're going to happen within the next 2 years. Yes, some people call it MMET. It's had a couple of names. It also is ready to begin the planning process. There's 5 or 6 steps that are necessary, and planning is the most important early step. we're waiting again for federal funding to actually begin the planning process. Once it does happen, it's going to be very exciting. It's going to be service that serves Madison, that serves a whole lot of other great cities in Wisconsin, all the way up to Eau Claire and all the way past Eau Claire to the Twin Cities. So that's a really exciting project. Green Bay, yes, the extension. So these would be trains running from Chicago through Milwaukee all the way up to Green Bay, or through Oshkosh and Appleton. That is, it's not ready to start planning yet. They need to do a feasibility study and take a couple other precursor steps. But that's also a very exciting project. Right now, they are wrapping up their budget for that planning step. Wisconsin DOT is the one that's currently putting together the budget, the scope of work for that planning step that they hope to start, again, as soon as funding becomes available for it. Wisconsin DOT and Minnesota DOT don't call it Borealis, they call it TCMC, which was the original working name of the project. And so this is the second TCMC train. It's a second daily trip that duplicates the existing Borealis. And it's also ready to start the planning process once funding becomes available.
Okay, the last one in our little segment here is not under WisDOT's thumb, but it is still, the majority of the track miles are within the state of Wisconsin, and that's the Eau Claire to St. Paul. It's being sponsored by the St. Croix Chippewa Rail Commission.
The Eau Claire Twin Cities project, very exciting, also needs to do a feasibility study before it can advance in the planning process. This is a very interesting plan because they're looking at having operators other than Amtrak, and they're looking at a different way of paying for track access. And it will be very interesting to see how these proceed and how it works out with the railroads.
Great, great. Thanks for taking time, Ian.